Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we am going to start the emergence of the USA as the world power, and the page we have is 20. In 1871, events in Africa, Asia, and the associated rivalries between the European powers were of little concern to the USA. Preoccupied domestic issues such as increasing US territory through westward expansion on the North American continent, as well as the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. People in the USA had little interest in the wider international issues. Throughout the 19th century, the US followed a policy of isolationism and looked inward, seeking to develop in its own way without interference to or involvement in the foreign issues. So, according to this paragraph, we need to understand one thing. I mean, it's all about, it's the base. You can say it's the background. I mean, we need to understand how the US become a world power. In the beginning, as I mentioned in my previous lecture about the scramble for Africa, in Scramble for Africa, I told you there was a great rivalry, there was a war, there was a rush, there was sort of a competition between the European countries, especially Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium. I mean, they were trying their level best to enhance their territory in Africa and Asia, right? So at the same moment in 18, you can say at the end of 19th century, the people of USA or the US government, they were far away from this scramble for Africa because they were not interested. Rather than they were observing a policy which was isolationism. What is the meaning of isolationism? Isolationism was a policy which was adopted by the government of America, and according to that policy, people are the government. They are concerned about their domestic issues. They need to concentrate on their domestic issues. And what were the domestic issues? I mean, especially there was a very important event which were taking place at the end of the 19th century, and it was the Civil War between the people of America, different states of American people. I mean, there was a black people who are trying their level best to getting the right for their freedom, and the white people. So there was a war. There was sort of conflict between them for the promotion of their rights, because they want to get the same rights equal to the white people. So this is the first paragraph. And what is the definition according to the book? Isolationism, the policy of isolating one's country from the affair of other nations by avoiding alliances and international commitments. However, the USA could not completely ignore events in the wider world. There was a risk that ambitious European nations would renew their interest in gaining colonies in the New World, North and South America. By the early 19th century, virtually all the Latin American colonies of once great Spanish and the Portuguese Empire had gained independence. Only Cuba, Puerto Rico remained under Spanish rule. Concerned that Spain would try to win back control of its former possession in South America, and that this would encourage other European powers to extend their empire into the Americas, led the US to approve the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. They stated that the USA would not interfere in European affairs, and that any attempt by European power to intervene in the Americas would be viewed by the USA as an act of aggression and would deal with accordingly. Mere bete, this is a very important point to understand. What is the point is? I mean, see, again, just give you a sort of introduction. Scramble of Africa, right? European people, European government trying their level best to acquire the maximum land, one thing. And in the beginning of 19th century, most of the Southern America, most areas of the Southern America was under the control of Spanish Empire. Understand? Beginning of 19th century. It means 1805, 1810, like that, right? So, I mean, American government has a sort of fear, or they have a sort of concern what is happening in Africa, and they were observing that if so many European countries, they're trying their level best to gain maximum land in Africa, and when they were satisfied, they were contented with the way they are doing in Africa, obviously they try their level best to retain some land in South America, because the American government does not have any influence on the southern part of the American continent. Is it clear? So naturally, there was a chance that it is possible. It is possible when they finish, the European countries, they finish their occupation, or their lust for the land or the power has a sort of satisfaction in Africa, then they try their level best to do the same stuff in Southern America, right? So, for that purpose, mentioned earlier, Britain, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, they have a lot of influence in Africa. So Spanish people, Spanish government was lagging behind because we can't see a Spanish occupation in Africa. So why? Because they were concentrating on the North America, right? The North American continent. They already had a lot of colonies in North America. So they were planning, if the Spanish government was not able to retain some land in Africa, so why don't you try the level best to retain the land they lost in North America? So this is the point of view which we're observing at that particular moment at the end of 19th century. So the American government, they signed a treaty, and the treaty was modern doctrine. Our treaty or doctrine is a kind of doctrine, means they established a doctrine. What was the doctrine? It was all about, we are not going to interfere anything in Europe. We don't have any concern in Africa as well. But any European nation, they even try to occupy or retain their lost land. Especially they were talking to Spain, right? In South America, it will be dealt accordingly. And at the same time, there was a lot of states, a lot of countries, they got freedom from Spanish Empire. Only Cuba and Puerto Rico, they were the two states which were, struggling, and they were under the control of Spain. Is it clear? Okay. In economic growth and the need for the trade, through the last 30 years of the 19th century, the US emerged as an increasingly influential world power. During this time, the country experienced enormous industry growth made possible by rich supplies of raw material, iron ore and oil, and the expansion of railways. A rapid increased population enhanced by large scale immigration provided a workforce, a market. Import duties protected US products from foreign competition, and by the end of the century, the USA was outstripping main European rivals in the production of coal, pig iron, steel, and cotton. A sudden economic downturn in 1893 alerted industrialists to danger of the over reliance on the domestic market, and they argued that the remedy was to sell more goods abroad, since European nations practiced protectionism throughout their empire. Access to the Chinese market was increasingly viewed as vital for the US future prosperity. This would require investment in a strong navy to protect merchant ships. It would also require the acquisition of overseas bases to protect US interests. While many politicians in the US supported this expansion view, some argued that maintaining the traditional policy of isolationism and avoiding foreign entanglements and responsibility was the best route to protect US interests. So before the start of 20th century, there was a debate which emerged in USA, and the debate was, either we need to change our policy of isolationism, or we need to do something more, because there was a sort of shortage of the market and the resources in USA. USA was becoming an increasing power, a world power in the beginning of 20th century. So they were desperate. We need new markets. It is not possible to find a market in Africa. Why? Because already there are so many nations, European nations, they were working in Africa as a market. So the possibility was just one. They have a possibility. Which one? They can reach to Chinese empire, because at that particular moment, China was a great empire. There was a great empire. There was huge population in China. So just imagine the map, world map. You people are sitting, for instance, in America. You need to cross Asia. You need to cross Europe, Africa, and in Asia, the third continent, just to reach China. So there is two or three things we need to understand. First of all, how could it be possible to have a new market, for American government? So according to their point of view, it is only possible if they have a very strong routes towards China. And obviously China is in Asia, so they need to cross Africa and Europe. For that purpose, they need to establish a strong navy. At the time, I told you earlier, there were two nations in reference to navy. I mean, the Britain, they got the best navy at that particular moment, and obviously German, they were struggling, but you can say in Europe, they got the second best navy. Clear? So just for America to China, first of all, they need a good route, one thing. Secondly, they have to establish a very strong navy. Why? Just to protect all the merchant ships from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific Ocean. So all this passage will be covered obviously by sea. So strong navy, new routes, and thirdly, access to Chinese market. There were those were three points they need to work on before the start of 20th century. And if they were able to achieve those points, then there won't be a, you can say no doubt about that America would going to be a superpower. But after achieving that, and it was not an easy task. You know why? Because obviously they need to cross two continents, they need to cross two oceans, and obviously they need to negotiate with the European powers for that purpose. And secondly, I told you one thing. There was a term which is used in this paragraph, and it was protectionism. What is protectionism? Protectionism is a policy which is adopted by the European nation, and according to that trading policy, I mean, it wasn't possible for America or any nation outside the Europe to sell their goods, to find a market in Europe. If you people are planning to sell something in Europe, you have to pay a lot of taxes. There was a great tariff. Tariff means it's a kind of a tax which is imposed on the merchandise which can taken from one continent to another continent. So I mean, obviously it is not possible that America would try to find a market in Europe. So they need to pay a lot of money for that, because there is a great amount of tariff they have to pay for that. And obviously the people in living in Europe, they are not foolish enough to buy American products so expensively, right? So, in many ways, the debate was settled by the event in Cuba when Spain was struggling to maintain control of its long-standing possession in a war against Cuban independence fighter. The USA remained neutral in the conflict until the explosion aboard the US battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. Although the US government seems to think that this was an accident, the American press believed that Spain was responsible, and it was heavily critical of the government's weak response to the incident. So, I mean, still, this debate wasn't. I mean, it was really hard to decide either we need to go to China or for a market or not. But there was an event which was very crucial at that particular moment, and which really forced American government to reconsider their policy of isolationism and how to counterattack their protectionism. And what was that? Cuba was under the control of Spanish Empire, but I mean, obviously the control, they were lagging a bit. I mean, it was difficult for Spain to maintain the control on Cuba. So America remained the neutral in that perspective, and there was explosion of U.S. battleship Maine in Havana. In Earlier, it was considered that was simply an incident when, according to press, then press pressurized the American government to reconsider their policy, because it was pre-planned. So they need to consider something, they need to establish their army. So that was the moment, that was the crux of the changing policy in American government. And we need to understand one thing, which is obviously, as I mentioned earlier in my previous lectures, excerpts are very important to understand, because they give you a lot of information, and if you want to get good marks, it is very important, very crucial to understand what is written in the references. So this is a reference, is 17th February 1989, and last time I told you, for a reference, just to understand a reference, there are two or three things you need to understand. First of all, the date. It's very crucial, because normally when there is a reference, this reference or any particular reference would give you a sort of picture. I mean, what is happening earlier. So obviously, what reference is all about the happening earlier. So it is 1989. We can understand it happened because why? Because it is written after the event of Maine, the battleship of America, right? To 500,000 Cuban starved or otherwise murdered have been added an American battleship and 300 American sailors lost as the direct result of the weak policy of our government towards Spain. If we had stopped the war in Cuba when duty and policy alike argue us to do, the Maine would have been afloat today, and the 300 homes now desolate would have been unscathed. It was an accident. They say perhaps it was, but accident or not, it would never happen if there had been peace in Cuba, as there would have been if we had done our duty. And it was an accident of remarkably convenient kind for Spain. 2 days ago, we had 5 battleships in the Atlantic. Today, we have 4. A few more such accidents will leave us the mercy of a Spanish fleet. See that. An extract from an article published in the New York Journal, 17 February 1898. Okay, it is possible that we have a reference in our question and they simply ask you just skim through this article, skim through this extract, and this, and just let us know, I mean, what is the point here which is discussed in this reference. So what was it all about? It was it was an article which pressurized, which criticized the government policy to remain neutral during the war between Cuba and Spanish Empire. Then they foresee that, okay, it, just consider it was an accident, no doubt about that, but see, if if the American government had a good navy, there were a lot of ships sailing in the Atlantic Ocean, this could not be possible. It, and the example was given in it, there were 5 battleships in Atlantic Ocean and there are 4, and we lost 300 sailors. Just consider, 300 families lost their people who were working for their bread and butter. They lost their life. And what is just the condition of 300 families? I mean, they lost their people. So if we have a lot of preparation, we had a good navy, the result would not be the same. So such reports did much to turn public opinion in favor of the battle with Spain, and in April 1898, just 2 years later, after the publication of this article, the U.S. government formally declared war. Victory in the Spanish-American War left the USA in the effective control of nominally independent Cuba. In addition, the U.S. gained other former Spanish possessions, including the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Almost immediately, the Filipinos rebelled, and in order to retain control, the USA was forced to fight a far longer and more costly war, 1899-1902, then one against Spain. Anti-imperialists such as the Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan protested against the acquisition of the foreign territories, arguing that it was a betrayal of the US isolationist tradition. However, Bryan's defeat to the sitting president William McKinley in the 1900 presidential election suggests that the majority of the US public supported the imperialist lobby. So according to this paragraph, obviously, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, this article forced your US government to reconsider their policy, and they did so. I mean, so they decided to go for a war against Spain, and very easily, very conveniently, they won the battle against the Spanish soldiers. And but I mean, Cuba got independence in the result, and US has an opportunity to gain the control of like Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. But there was, I mean, obviously in Philippines, the people rebelled for that thing, but and there was a costly war for the Americans, though they won the battle, but still they lost a lot of people for that. And there was anti-imperialist. In 1900, there was a presidential election in America. There were 2 lobbyists. They were working imperialist and anti-imperialist. According to anti-imperialist, we shouldn't be the Democratic candidate. They simply accentuate to retain the policy of isolationism, because they simply try convince people for that. I mean, we don't need to I mean, put ourselves in danger. We don't need to put ourselves into a battle again with other countries. We have a lot of peace accordingly, and we don't need to, I mean, lost our people for no reason. But I mean, in the presidential election, the opposite are the imperialist candidate McKinley. They won the election, and it was a clear sign that the people of America, they were willing to change their traditional policy. Um, the development of the USA as a world power. The less than a year into the second term, McKinley was assassinated, and his vice president Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in. Roosevelt fully supported the new imperialist direction of the US foreign policy, believing that it was incumbent on all civilized and orderly power to insist on the proper policing of the world. He followed policies designed to extend his country influence globally. So, what was the policy he adopted? First of all, ensure that the USA gained control of the building and operations of the Panama Canal, which opened in 1914. This allowed ships to pass between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean without the long and the hazardous voyage around the Cape Horn at the tip of the South America. In both strategic and commercial terms, this added to the USA global influence. So, actually, in 1900, McKinley won the presidential election, and again he got an opportunity for the second term. Okay, in the second term, he again McKinley was the president, but he was assassinated, and he was replaced by the vice president Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was more energetic, more supportive to the doctrine that we need to enhance our power, need to enhance our influence on the global world. For that purpose, you remember when I started my lecture, I told you that America decided to change their policy, and what was the crux of the changing policy? Very first thing, very first ambition was to extend their merchandise to China. And for that perspective, for this purpose, they need to have a good army. Okay, so in 1914, they got an opportunity under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. What? I mean, they took the control of Panama Canal, and it was a huge setback to the European nation for that, because once America was able to take the control of Panama Canal, through this, it is far more easier for the American trading ships to travel, to sail from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific Ocean. So once they were in the Pacific Ocean, so accordingly they can simply travel towards Atlantic. They cross African continent, and they were in Pacific Ocean. So in Pacific Ocean, so they were at the tip of Asian continent. So this is the very first thing they got, and the secondly, he granted that Cuba would effectively remain under the U.S. control by drawing up the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution 1903. Under its terms, the USA was able to dictate Cuba foreign policy and all its commercial activities. The USA was also granted rights over key lands on the island, including the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. And this is the same Guantanamo Bay which was very famous couple of years before, because most of the Taliban supreme leaders were taken in that Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. The Roosevelt corollary to the modern doctrine introduced in 1904 stated that the USA would intervene if any Caribbean state was threatened by internal or external factor. This is again very important point. I mean, they extend the modern doctrine. Previously, we came to know that according to modern doctrine, there was only for the people, only for the European countries. I mean, European countries were not allowed to pierce in American continent, especially in South American continent. But now, I mean, it was also alarming for the Caribbean countries like West Indies, like Jamaica. And if those countries were hit, those countries were, you can say, got some sort of fear from European nation. No, it's the responsibility of America. So see that how America is increasing its influence over the Caribbean countries. So it's apart from the America as well, right? So the USA in 1914, the USA attempt to enhance its power base in the Pacific region, and in particular to gain trading rights in China, were less successful here. It met stern opposition from well-established imperial nations such as Britain, Germany, France, and Russia, as well as from the newly emerging power of Japan. Nevertheless, by 1914, the USA had emerged as a prosperous and strong regional power with a growing influence over world financial markets and a newfound commitment to its own form of imperialistic expansion. So I mean, before the start of the First World War, America was a very influential country, especially America, the way America was growing as industrial state. America has a lot of influence on North America, South America, then on Caribbean countries. So see how America developed its influence on different countries, especially the continents. And though America was able to have a market in China, but the experience was not that much successful. You know why? Because first of all, the huge or the large area of Chinese empire. One thing. Secondly, the Chinese empire was very weak at that particular moment before the start of First World War, and there was colony of Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan. There were five powers already working in China. So I mean, then finding a new market and traveling so long, crossing two continents, I mean, it was not an easy job for the American, but still they have a chance there. And at that particular moment in 1914, they start a first world war. And inshallah, hope to talk to you about this in my next lecture. So comes to the question. For instance, we covered, see, why did the USA move away from its traditional isolationist foreign policy in the period 1871 to 1914? I mean, you can have a lot of references in it. For instance, I mean, it's all about, you can say minor event. You can simply write it on the minor event. Secondly, you can write about the new market, I mean, finding in China. Secondly, I mean, there was sort of fear of the European nations, especially the Spain, to regain its control in the Southern America. So I mean, we have already told you something about that. How far was the President Theodore Roosevelt responsible for the US move towards a more expansionist foreign policy? Yes, we already studied this in the previous paragraphs. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, he was more energetic, more you can say positive, more optimistic to increase the influence of America in not only in North America and South America, but other than the other areas. So I mean, you can simply skim through the previous pages. You can understand what it means in this question. Third, look at the cartoon in the source A opposite. What does it suggest about the emergence of the US as a world power by the time it was published in 1906? So you can say it's simply it's a tank, US tank, the Mingo, then it's Europe, and Monroe Doctrine. So, I mean, according to this cartoon, we understand one thing. It's all about the modern doctrine. What was the modern doctrine? I mentioned twice. I mean, it's all for the European nation. They are not allowed to come to America, North America, or South America. So it's all about. So see that. I mean, it's not that difficult. I mean, if you people just give 30 minutes to 1 hour, you will be easily understand what is happening and how the USA become world power before the start of First World War. So it's the time to say call for a day to my lecture. Hope to see you again.